Welcome everybody to one more Talks at Google event. Today with us is Mark Binelli. His new book is called Screamin Jay Hawkins, All-Time Greatest Hits. The rhythm and blues wildman, Screamin Jay Hawkins, only had a single hit, the classic I Put a Spell on You, and was often written off as a novelty act or worse, an offense to his race. But his myth-making was legendary. Mark Binelli embraces the man and legend to create a fantastical portrait of this unlikeliest of protagonists. At Rolling Stone, Binelli has profiled some of the greatest musicians of our time, and this novel plays with the focus on authenticity in much music writing about African Americans. Binelli is the author of Detroit City is the Place to Be and Sacco and Vanzetti Must Die, as well as contributing editor at Rolling Stone and Men's Journal. Please join me in welcoming Mark Binelli to Google.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's a real treat to be here. And I'm going to just read a quick section first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how I came to write the book, and just tell you a little bit more about Screamin Jay Hawkins. I guess, you know, even for people who haven't heard of Jay, you've probably heard "I Put a Spell on You" or some version of that song. It's his one hit, as Boris said. It was recorded in 1956. It's been covered many times. The most famous version of it is probably not his version, but a version done by Nina Simone. Creedence Clearwater Revival did a rock version that's pretty popular, and then years later, people like Marilyn Manson covered it. It was sampled by the Notorious B.I.G. and the song "Kick in the Door" to pretty great effect. Later years, She and Him covered the song, and his own version has been used in films and commercials. So yeah, I was you know, his own penchant for myth making is what really kind of brought me to Jay as a subject, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after this reading. The section I'm going to read for you is about part of his myth that sort of came up posthumously. He died in 1999. A year or two later, stories started to appear in the press about how he had made claims before he died that he'd fathered up to 75 illegitimate children. And somebody created a website actually called Jay's Kids, and they basically put out a call to these children to come forward, register with the website. There was some talk of making a documentary film and actually having a family reunion of these kids. I'm not really sure if any of this ever happened, but the scene I'm about to read kind of imagines what this family reunion might have been had it taken place. Funnily enough, it's the only scene in the book that Jay himself doesn't appear in because he's dead. But yeah, it's pretty self-contained. I think that's all you need to know. So here we go. They began arriving at the Sunset Marquee just after 7, though the invitation said 8. A young white girl holding a clipboard greeted them enthusiastically in the lobby. "Oh, Mr. Hendricks, welcome," she said to Marvin Hendricks, who arrived at closer to 8:30. "How is your flight from Detroit, correct?" She was correct. She also made clear her knowledge of what he did for a living, a staff therapist at a juvenile detention center, and certain family details, 2 kids. And Marvin got the sense, as she ushered him toward the courtyard pool area where the reunion was taking place, that she had probably also memorized his age and marital status, 37, divorced, as well as, of course, his ranking among the bastards. According to a password-protected section of the official worldwide website, Marvin was the 13th male and 24th overall of Screamin Jay Hawkins' extramarital offspring. They'd come from Philadelphia, Paris, Southern California, Juneau, Texas, Tallahassee, Guanajuato, Coney Island. They displayed a multiplicity of ages, body types, complexions, styles of dress. The youngest, a 7-year-old from Bowling Green, Kentucky, was accompanied by an ever-watchful mother. The oldest, a 53-year-old surgeon practicing in Toronto, brought his own teenage daughter, a first-year art history major at McGill, who wanted to take a tour of the new Getty Center and see the Hollywood Walk of Fame. One of the brothers had actually dressed like Jay. Cape, skull staff, bones through his nose, the works. Though maybe he wasn't actually a brother, but just some guy hired by the organizers of the event. They'd shown up for a variety of reasons. Some, like Janessa, an airline pilot based out of Minneapolis, had known their father's identity from an early age. For others, the revelation had come more recently and been received as a seismic shift. Marvin, for example, whose mother, an 11th grade English teacher, private and bookish, had always refused to say much about his biological father, except that she hadn't known him, really, beyond that one-night stand. He'd come through Detroit while on military leave, died in Vietnam. But something one of Marvin's uncles had said, a crack one Christmas Eve, had always made him suspect the Vietnam story was bullshit. Marvin read his uncle's hint as implying his true father had been a musician of some renown, a genetic fantasy Marvin found both flattering and certainly more fun to secretly speculate upon. Had Otis Redding or Miles Davis, gigging in Detroit one wintry eve in 1965, found themselves smitten by the young cocktail waitress at Baker's Keyboard Lounge? Or perhaps it being Detroit, after all, one of the temptations, or even, would his mother provide such a throbbing neon clue? Marvin Gaye himself? She finally confessed in the most awkward way possible at one of their regular Wednesday dinners. As Marvin sat down at the table, he noticed a newspaper clipping, neatly folded and tucked beneath his napkin. A short article about how the late musician responsible for I Put a Spell on You, a song Marvin only knew from the Nina Simone version, had fathered scores of illegitimate children, all of whom had been invited to attend a family reunion in Los Angeles, providing they brought some manner of proof and were willing to sign a release form for a planned documentary. Marvin Gaye, his mother exclaimed, when he revealed his own long-harbored notions. But you know you were named after your grandfather's best friend, Marvin Sturgis. Marvin had known that, of course, but had convinced himself Sturgis must be a convenient cover story. Screamin Jay Hawkins, though, a number of the children, not only Marvin, found this news difficult to process. They went out to record stores, some of them for the first time in years, picked up greatest hits CDs, and listened to their father's strange, jokey tunes while scrutinizing liner note photographs for some trace of a familial resemblance, poring over the details of the old man's ridiculous, unbelievable life. They'd all come to the reunion bearing varying degrees of skepticism. Some of them wondered if the organizers of the event hoped to turn their group meeting into a kind of freak show. Others held vague hopes of a surprise monetary reward, some manner of deathbed amends ordered by their absent father, and came picturing dozens of gathered heirs seated in folding chairs beneath a massive tent as a lawyer solemnly read from the revised will. Most of them hoped to find, to a greater or lesser degree, some trace of themselves, something that had existed out in the world for these many years, scattered but a true part of them, something no one could deny as real. Over the course of the evening, Marvin met a catalog photographer, a dog catcher, a meteorologist, an Asian studies professor, a retired professional soccer coach, a coder at Netscape, a janitor, a 26-year-old mother of 5 from the Bay Area, a gay single dad from Wichita. They'd all missed having a biological father around, even though some had stepdads or other surrogates. In Marvin's case, his mother's 2 older brothers. They shared such intimacies delicately at first. A few of them flirted in spite of the unspoken taboo. Marvin had lived in an international dorm at the University of Michigan, and one of the Indian guys down the hall had taught him a few curse words in Hindi, including one Marvin remembered to this day, benchud, which his friend had translated as sister fucker, and which Marvin had for some reason found enduringly amusing, as he explained to a young lady from Baltimore as she sipped a cloudy drink from a martini glass. A young lady, his half-sister. The context being they both spotted a dog catcher shamelessly hitting on the Asian studies professor. Though if he was forced to be completely honest, Marvin would have had to admit that his injection of sister fucking into the conversation was not wholly innocent of suggestive intent. She didn't bite, though, or rather, she might have, but they were interrupted by another half-brother, who introduced himself. This sort of interruption was happening all evening, of course, the reunion being a reunion of complete strangers, after all. and who turned out to be the only working musician Marvin would meet that evening. He lived in Nashville, he said, where he'd been doing steady session work as a bass player for the past decade or so. Stuff you'd never have heard of, man, he told Marvin, chuckling, unless you're into Garth Brooks. You've played on Garth Brooks records? Marvin asked. No, that's just an example, his bass-playing half-brother said. Cats like him, though. Marvin nodded. He never had any real affinity for music. Played no instruments, listened mostly to the radio in his car, or to one of a handful of the same albums he'd been spinning since college. Best of compilations by Al Green, The Police, Bob Marley, Prince, some older rap. The newer stuff all sounded the same to him, knuckleheaded and abrasive, though he realized this probably just meant he was getting old. They also couldn't help resenting the old man as much as they found him intriguing, the mystery of him. His songs played on a loop, and whenever the most famous one came up, they joked about how Hawkins should have thought about casting a second spell that would have prevented his women from getting knocked up. Others wondered darkly if the spell in question, like so much magic, came with a curse attached, and if perhaps they were the result of that curse, the unintended consequence of Jay's version of the monkey's paw. You can fuck all the women you want, but every single one of them's leaving pregnant. 75 children he'd apparently estimated before he kicked. The insane numbers had been reported in the papers as a jokey news of the weird type of story, though to many of them it wasn't terribly funny, but rather disquieting. Would anyone want to claim membership in such a messy diaspora? Not long after his mother's confession, Marvin locked himself in the bathroom and began vomiting into her doily-covered toilet. He'd always instinctively hated the man who'd screwed her and ran off to the war, or to the next gig, wherever he'd gone, partly because Marvin was a bit of a mama's boy himself. When he got older, he told friends he wished his mother would date, but in his heart he clutched her love with greedy fingers, uneager to share. Now, finally having a face to put on her fleeting suitor, what a face. It simply wasn't easy to stomach. This guy, he'd wanted to shout at her. Jesus, the man was a clown. And the music, such camp. He popped the disc from his car stereo after only a few listens, switching to the jazz station to cleanse his palate. The CD case would glint from the passenger seat floor for the next several months, mocking him. Why had he come to the reunion then? Well, curiosity, of course, that was the main thing. And while, I don't know, he was trying to explain himself to his Baltimore sister and country bass brother, as disgusted as I was upon first learning of all of this, he gestured at the crowd, quickly adding, no offense. But it did mess with my sense of, I don't know, uniqueness? But then I thought about it some more, and I realized, in a certain sense, this makes us more unique. I mean, how many other people have a miniature army of siblings out in the world, biologically programmed to have one another's backs? That's the dream, at any rate. Except I'm still trying to get my head around the strength of the connect. He'd lost them. The Nashville brother had cocked his head in the direction of the ether, trying to make out the song that had come up, and their sister was watching this professional appraisal play out on his face. Marvin hadn't heard the song before either. It was a ballad, delivered with unusual sincerity, at least for their pops. My only prayer will be, someday you'll care for me, but it's only make-believe. Conway Twitty, the country session musician, finally muttered. Marvin had to admit that, as the evening wore on, his father's music had begun to take on a certain power. The exceedingly strange context played a part, no doubt, along with his own increased inebriation. True, all true. But there was something in the repetition as well. The Nashville brother turned back to them and mentioned that he'd received a letter from a conceptual artist based in Berlin. The artist planned to remake all 31 Elvis Presley pictures, only with Screamin Jay as the lead. Well, Screamin Jay, an actor playing him, obviously. A response the artist wrote to Hawkins' claim that he'd been offered the script for Jailhouse Rock before Presley, only to be rejected by studio bosses as too scary and too black. The artist had seen a photograph of the session player in a news story in Der Spiegel about Jay's children and found the resemblance uncanny, and she wanted to talk to him about being her Jay. The Nashville brother said he was considering the offer, though he'd done some research on her earlier work, which involved quite a bit of nudity along with certain Christian imagery that could be interpreted as sacrilegious, and worried it might prove controversial in a way that could hamper future gigs. Nashville's still a pretty conservative town, you know, he said. Marvin, really all of them to a half-sibling, had nurtured secret hopes of the party turning into something like an actual family reunion. Not immediately, of course, but over the course of the evening, primed by booze and the power of suggestion, and who could say, a certain sort of striving or refusal to take no for an answer, born of the same stubborn Hawkins gene that collectively would bond the group in ways that they could never predict. They wanted, in other words, to believe in the triumph of nature. They vowed as they parted ways at the end of the night to do it again each year in different cities, to never lose touch with one another. But the cameras only came the one time, and it's not clear if they ever followed through. So that's just a little scene from the book. So yeah, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to write this book. I've been a contributing writer at Rolling Stone for, I've been a contributor since 2000, and I started freelancing for them even before that. In the early days, I wrote primarily about music. More recently, I've shifted to writing about politics and just sort of general features. I wrote a nonfiction book about Detroit. Detroit City is the Place to Be, that came out in 2012. But as I said, I started at Rolling Stone primarily as a music writer, and I came to music writing in a kind of roundabout way. A lot of people on staff at Rolling Stone who focus on music are hardcore music writers, like old school record store type guys who just know everything. I can't hang with them. I came to writing about musicians more as a writer, meaning I like to profile musicians because they're generally very extreme and interesting characters. I was writing about different sorts of arts and culture for a while. And when you interview actors or other sorts of artists, they're much more controlling. Excuse me. They're much more controlling of their image than musicians who are much more likely to kind of let it all hang out and just be themselves, which for a writer, that's ideal. So my first profile for Rolling Stone, it was a one-page profile at the front of the magazine, was Mo Tucker, the drummer from the Velvet Underground, who at the time I was living in Atlanta, she was living in South Georgia. She was actually working at a Walmart. The Velvet Underground had reunited and done a brief tour, but then it kind of fell apart because of some conflicts between Lou Reed and Sterling Morrison, I believe, or maybe it was Lou Reed and Cale. But anyway, she was left, back at Walmart working in this little town in South Georgia. And so for that very first story, I drove down there, sat with her at a kitchen table, heard from her about learning the Walmart cheer. My first sort of longer feature was a profile of Hank Williams III, who's the son of Hank Jr. He looks, if anyone's seen him, he looks eerily like his grandfather. He's tall and skinny and sounds exactly like him. But he was performing a mixture of like classic country tunes like his grandfather's and thrash metal and punk. And that was that story actually got him sent to rehab. Weirdly, I drove up to Nashville to meet with him. We took a tour bus from Nashville to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had a gig. Before we even left Nashville, he stopped at his drug dealer's house, talked about drinking and doing drugs, basically, or was doing that the entire weekend I was with him, which didn't seem like a huge deal to me because in the rock world and the hip-hop world, none of that stuff is that big of a deal. Apparently, it is a big deal in the country world. And so after my story ran, he was summoned to his record label, and when he got there, they had staged an intervention. Like Waylon Jennings was there, his father, the guy who wrote the song "Ring of Fire." So I felt kind of bad about that. But I did early stories. In the early days, whenever I did a profile of a rapper or an R&B artist, they would take me bowling. Oddly, I went bowling in Columbus, Ohio, with Busy Bone of Bone Thugs and Harmony. I went bowling with Outkast in Atlanta. I started to feel like I was being profiled, possibly that they were thinking what is this nerdy white guy gonna want to do? Let's take him bowling. That's what he'll like. Anyway, you know, the thing I found after years of doing this was that fringier characters in the rock world were much more interesting to me than some of the bigger superstars, which, you know, sort of takes us to Screamin Jay Hawkins. I've profiled, I've written cover stories for Rolling Stone about really huge artists, and I found over the years that the more people I meet at parties or friends, the more they're interested in a particular artist. That tends to be inversely proportional to how interesting they end up being to me as a writer. So I've written cover stories about, you know, Paul McCartney, Bruce Springsteen, Jay-Z, Radiohead, Britney Spears, and really, with the exception of Britney Spears, I found them all, you know, really likable and smart and interesting. And but it's, you know, because they're such huge stars, there's just a level of distance. You know, even though it's Rolling Stone and we get lots of time with them, it's really hard to get them off message when, you know, they've gotten to that level. They've generally gotten very good at sort of saying what they want to say, no matter what you ask them, and your access is somewhat limited. And so again, for me, musicians who are sort of on the periphery became what I kind of really loved writing about more. In the case of Jay Hawkins, who recorded "I Put a Spell on You" in 1956, he was definitely, you know, he's definitely a cult artist. I first heard "I Put a Spell on You" probably in the Jim Jarmusch film "Stranger Than Paradise," which was an independent film that came out in the mid-'80s. I saw it years later in college, and in the film he makes he plays one of the characters plays "I Put a Spell on You" throughout the film, and it's a very considering it was recorded half a century ago, it's a really an oddly sort of timeless sounding song. I was at I think it was in a pharmacy or somewhere about a week or two ago, and I heard they were just playing a Chuck Berry song on the over the speakers, and it was one of his big hits, maybe Johnny Be Good, and you know, it's a great song, but it just struck me hearing it. It felt very much of its time. It felt like a song from the 50s, like of that era. Whereas if you listen to "I Put a Spell on You," there's a strange, to use the same word again, very timeless quality to it. You know, it's a very funny song in certain ways, which humor is hard to do in music without sort of crossing the line into novelty. Yet he also, there's also kind of a creepy, haunted element to it. He obviously screams and sort of howls and shouts throughout the song. That there's kind of a weird waltz tempo. There's something about it that really, you know, still works and does not feel dated. But what really, you know, it wasn't like I heard the song and thought I must write about this guy. It was probably, you know, many years later, I happened to be flipping through the liner notes of a compilation CD by Hawkins, and realized that he had this penchant for myth making that was just unbelievably great. He, you know, in interviews, he claimed that he had been raised by a tribe of Indians in Cleveland, that he was a boxing champion in Alaska, that he lied about his age when he was 14 so he could fight in World War II. You know, it just goes on and on. You know, even the actual recording of "I Put a Spell on You," actually, I think I'll just read just a couple of paragraphs from the very beginning of the book. He you know, he has a very funny, he makes some very funny claims about how that song got recorded. This is just like a page. The origin story typically goes something like this. On September 12th, 1956, a rhythm and blues aspirant named Hawkins, 27 years old, native of Cleveland, entered a New York recording studio to cut a handful of sides for OK Records, a subsidiary of the Columbia label. One of the songs Hawkins brought to the session, an original he penned himself, followed a heartbroken protagonist who, in a fit of desperation, turns to black magic to beguile the strayed object of his affection. He'd actually recorded another version of I Put a Spell on You months earlier. It's difficult to imagine considering the sturdiness of Hawkins' baritone. But at that time, he crooned the number entirely straight. His model was Johnny Ace, the Memphis preacher's son, with the impossibly tender voice. Specifically the hit single Pledging My Love, a favorite of Hawkins, with its syrupy arrangement, heavy on the tinkling vibes. I Put a Spell on You, Jay said, was a sweet ballad when I wrote it. Arnold Maxon, the Columbia A&R man meant to supervise the session, wasn't interested in ballads, though. Rock and roll, that mongrel genre with its raw appeals to youth, had become the sound of the moment. Hawkins and the session musicians, to Maxon, sounded hopelessly stiff by comparison. In frustration, he ordered up a case of cheap wine, Swiss Colony, an Italian muscatel. We all got blind drunk, Jay said. The singer awoke the following afternoon, worked over by a brute of a hangover, the rest of the night lost in the fog of war. Nearly 2 weeks later, when Maxon presented him with the newly pressed 78 recording of I Put a Spell on You, Hawkins hardly recognized his song. Its melody had been sliced apart and overtaken by a shuffling somnambulist's rhythm, the vocal track similarly debased by a series of drunken screams and groans and yells, Hawkins' words. His sweet ballad, ensorcelled, now walked like a zombie. The arms of his lovelorn hero, thus embodied, were no longer outthrust to embrace, but to strangle. And that is how I became Screamin Jay Hawkins, Jay said. 10 days later, I had to learn the song. So that's his tale of how he wrote the song, and he, presented that straight-faced his whole life. Most likely, it's not true. I mean, most likely he had been doing that sort of shouting, and it's a long tradition in sort of jive music and R&B, blues shouters, and he'd been recording other songs like that. So it seems unlikely that he got so drunk that he just somehow did this. But it's typical of his style in interviews, and for me as a writer, I had never thought as a person who wrote about music for my day job, I had never thought I would sort of that would bleed over into my fiction writing. It seemed like I wrote about music plenty for work, and I love doing that. The fiction would be something else. But when I came across Jay's story, it just was such a perfect picaresque. It was the kind of the ultimate rock biopic in a certain way, like the arc of his life as he told it. And I also loved that the idea of writing about him was such a perverse choice. If you were going to make a list of musicians, iconic musicians who would be worthy of a novel or a biography or a film biopic, Screamin Jay Hawkins would be very, very, very low on most people's lists, right? He's not anybody's idea of like a super iconic figure. He's a very cult figure, and there are plenty of people who really love him, including myself. But he's a very odd choice, which really appealed to me. He only has the one hit. He's not very well known. And I, as I kind of thought about it more, I realized, if I initially actually thought about writing a straight biography and really properly researching it and approaching it that way. Then I realized what if I just took him at his word, assumed all these stories were true, and wrote the novel that way. And that to me, that unlocked that was the key that unlocked it for me. I mean, it was just, it suddenly, it gave me so many liberties to just do what I wanted as a writer. And my mantra basically became, what if it's all true? And that was incredibly appealing. So I very deliberately did not research his claims at all. I could have tried to find his military records and found out if he had actually fought in World War II. I didn't really want to know any of that stuff. What I did end up doing was sort of researching around his many claims. So rather than finding out specifically what his actions were at that time, I did find out that there were people 14-year-olds who lied about their age to fight in World War II. So that is plausible. There was this patriotic fervor at the time. People were doing that. I researched, he claimed that he'd seen combat in the Pacific. So I looked into, where he might have been stationed, what sorts of roles African Americans had in the Army at that time, how segregated, things were. That kind of period detail was really actually very fun to research. And then I still had that liberty of making up these scenes within his life. I also was very drawn to a few of the other details that he had sort of sprinkled throughout interviews in his career. One of them was, his whole stage persona was very outrageous. I mean, this was like 56, 57, so this is, decades before George Clinton, decades before Alice Cooper, other people who were, Kiss, very theatrical rockers. He was the original person doing this kind of stuff. So he would wear, he would put a fake bone through his nose. He carried a staff with like a human skull on it and wore these crazy capes and costumes and would actually jump out of a coffin. The coffin part was apparently Alan Freed's idea, the famous rock DJ. And in interviews later in life, Jay claimed that he hated the coffin, that he would get really drunk. He actually says he developed a drinking problem because he was so scared of getting in the coffin, and he dreaded it so much he would just have to get drunk every night before the shows. And it's a funny story, and who knows if it was true or not, or if he was just kind of saying that, because it's kind of funny. But to me, that was the moment where, what was kind of a funny idea, taking this guy's life story and making it into an entire novel, also, had a potential for more depth. Just imagining him, this sort of cartoonish figure, actually, mortally terrified, a night after night, like staring down death and locked into these dark thoughts. I love the tension between taking that totally seriously and then also, presenting him as he was, this sort of, outrageous, outwardly in many ways ridiculous figure. Similarly, his whole shtick was problematic and controversial as far as race goes. The way he was dressed was like, almost like a sort of witch doctor from a bad, Looney Tunes cartoon from the 40s. He was denounced by the NAACP at one point, and yet I thought, he was possibly doing some very interesting things with that, in terms of just playing around with audience expectations, specifically white audience expectations of the time. Years later, he released an album called Black Music for White People, and I think that's it's a telling title. And I think he knew what he was doing at a certain level. At least in the book, I imagine that he did, and I think was sort of tweaking audience ideas of authenticity, which can be especially acute when it comes to African American artists, and you can go all the way back to blues musicians like Leadbelly and come all the way forward to gangster rap. This idea of like a craving for authenticity from certain artists, and his wearing that kind of costume seems like a sort of in-your-face mockery and rejection of that, at least to me. So I loved, in those ways, I thought there were opportunities to kind of go a little bit deeper with him. So talking about the Coffin, I thought I would just wrap up with one more very short reading. It's a scene I imagined of him and his manager, a guy named Stan Pat. It's a scene of them coffin shopping after they first come up with the idea to do this, and it's just a couple of pages. The day after their meeting with Freed, Stan and Jay visited a funeral parlor in Gowanus. The coffins were arranged by price, in subsets of color. Mr. Browning, the funeral director, pointed out the key features of various models: finer grains of wood, the ornate gilding lavished upon more Baroque grips and handles. Jay, lagging behind, ran a finger along the center of a mahogany lid, polished to an oily sheen. Leaning forward at the waist, he held his nose inches from the casket and inhaled deeply. Looked roomy enough. How well ventilated are these things? Jay called out. Browning, misunderstanding, assured him they were airtight. They'd have to drill some holes in the head end, Jay thought. Easily done. Jay cracked one of the fancier models. The deep red lining of the inside of the box brought to mind a dissected animal, guts. He stroked the lining with the back of his hand, the way he would a baby's cheek or a woman's. Something soft, caught asleep. Solid, he said. He allowed the lid to drop. It made a clattering sound as it fell shut. I think we're probably in the market for something a bit simpler, Stan murmured, flipping through a catalog provided by Browning. On the page on which he'd paused, the depicted coffin, a rich oak, had been lit to resemble a perfect cut of steak. Certainly, Browning said, we accommodate the entire range. Father was a very pious man, Stan said. He would have considered expenses like these. This is true, Jay interrupted, but we also want Daddy to be comfortable. No one is talking about sacrificing comfort, Stan said. I just think we would be respecting his wishes by finding a happy medium and... Happy, Jay said. You going to be in there or him? There's always cremation. He wouldn't have wanted that, Jay said. Toss the old scoundrel in the oven, Stan said. Might be kind of satisfying. Poor old Dad, Jay said. I'm sorry you had one really bad son. Remember what Mother said. Money is tight, boys, Stan said. That greedy cow, Jay said, always grabbing up 15% of Father's hard-earned income, spending it on Cuban rum, dog races. Mr. Browning, I hope you'll forgive our banter, Stan said. It's our way of grieving. Clearing his throat, Browning asked, do you have a pastor to say a few words? He wasn't a religious man, Jay said. Catering? All set. Flowers? What do you think, brother? Too much? Stan asked. Might be distracting to the audience. He means the mourners, Stan said. Of course, Jay said, and also too feminine. There's that, Stan said. I ain't Little Richard, Jay said. You mean the deceased, Stan said. Daddy was not Little Richard, Jay said. He means the rhythm and blues singer, Stan said. Wop bop a loo ba, an inside joke. Daddy would go around saying, who do you think you're talking to, Little Richard? Not that Daddy listened to rhythm and blues music, Jay said. He just heard the name and found it amusing, Stan said. He thought it sounded like a slang term for a tiny, you know, Jay said. He was a stupid, stupid man, Stan said. Amused by the vulgar, Jay said. I'll miss the old bastard, Stan said. Browning asked when the body would be arriving. Stan Pat explained that they would be taking the coffin with them. Private viewing, Jay said. Someone must prepare the body. Mother, Stan said. She insists, Jay said. The undertaker said this was highly unusual. He repeated the statement when he saw the van in which the pair proposed to load the coffin. On his way out the door, Stan said, we'll need a receipt. That's it. Thank you. Thanks. Great to be here.